Hello, and welcome to my podcast where I discuss the origins of all sorts of things. I'm your host, Danny Payne, and this is On the Origin of Everything. Today I'm talking about playgrounds. We've all played in them at school during recess or at a local park. Perhaps you're taking your own kids to a playground these days, or have in the past. And it's quite possible that you've gotten hurt when playing in the perilous landscape of a playground. Have you ever wondered why there are teeter-totters, jungle gyms, tires, and random concrete structures in playgrounds? To be honest, I had never questioned any of it. Playgrounds are playgrounds. And these things are everywhere, and they're not cheap to build either. Today we're going to learn all about how we got them and why they are the way they are. Let's jump in. The first outdoor public recreational parks existed in ancient Athens, where big yards called gymnasiums were used to exercise and play sports. But the origin of playgrounds as we know them today is more appropriately placed in 1850s Berlin, where play areas called sand gardens began. Sand gardens were an offshoot of Friedrich Froebel's endeavor, the Child Nurture and Activity Institute, which he later renamed Kindergarten. Friedrich Froebel really believed in the importance of early childhood education through self-expression, creativity, socialization, and motor skills development. His students were learning outdoors and working with materials like clay, string, paper, and sand, meant to inspire creativity and ingenuity. Kindergarten, by the way, translates into garden for children, or children's garden. So, kindergarten influenced sand gardens to spread across Europe, and this concept made it over to Boston in the 1880s to serve a specific need. Social activist Kate Gannett Wells and her colleagues saw that immigrant children in the north end of Boston were living and playing in crowded, dangerous streets. They needed a safer place to play. So Wells and her colleagues paid for a pile of sand to be poured onto the yard of a church for them to play in. This actually worked, and sand gardens were placed throughout the area, mostly near settlement houses where recently arrived immigrant families lived. It's important to note that wealthier kids typically had their own yards to play in. It was the poorer kids, often immigrant kids, who needed these free communal play areas. So the earliest playgrounds didn't have swings or slides, they were just piles of sand. We're building this origin story literally from the ground up, aren't we? I remember arriving in the United States as a kid and thinking it was kind of weird that my American grandparents had a sandbox in their backyard. Little did I know that I was participating in a 250-year-old tradition as I played in the sand with my toy dump truck. Boston had the first American sand garden in 1885, and it wasn't long before sand piles appeared in schoolyards. Boston gave America its first sand gardens, but it was San Francisco that gave America the first real playground. In 1887, the children's playground in Golden Gate Park was built. It was still just some sand when it opened, but it was a fenced-off area specifically for children, and what made it significant was that it was permanent, municipally funded, and for the public. This was a major turning point where an American city, for the first time, carved a public space for children to play in. It ushered in a new era of playground experimentation across the country. The children's playground in Golden Gate Park would add more components over the following years after its opening, like a shelter providing shade and protection from rain, swings, slides, seesaws, a carousel, and even animal rides. It was a whole operation, requiring city funds to build and maintain, and also supervise. Other cities began to do the same, as San Francisco had done at Golden Gate Park, and for the next 20 years or so, it was a free-for-all in terms of design. City planners, engineers, and architects improvised what their playgrounds would look like. Chicago was another early leader in playground development. through the efforts of social reformer and author Jane Addams. She had traveled to London where she visited a social settlement, which is a type of welfare agency aimed at serving the needs of underprivileged neighborhoods. She brought this model back to Chicago, raised funds to rent a mansion, opened a kindergarten, later added a nursery, educational facilities, and eventually purchased more buildings to contain a gymnasium, housing for children, space for social clubs, and of course, playgrounds. These playgrounds offered sand piles, swings, slides, ball courts, and more. This settlement was known as the Hull House, Hull House, after the name of the original owner of the mansion, and it became a model for other cities. Teddy Roosevelt called it the most notable civic achievement of any American city. New York had its own playground movement shaped by the efforts of social reformers Jacob Riis and Lillian Wald and the Outdoor Recreation League. Small parks were acquired in slum districts for playground use under the 1887 Small Parks Act. Among them was Seward Park. These early New York playgrounds were located in densely populated immigrant neighborhoods, some of which were located on rooftops to address space constraints. School boards also got involved in various cities, opening playgrounds in their schoolyards for students to enjoy during the school year, of course, but they were open to the public during the summer. It was a place for kids to safely play during those summer months. I'm using the word safely loosely here because these early playgrounds were not designed with safety in mind. Yeah, they were safer than playing in busy city streets, but the early designs of slides, jungle gyms, swings, and seesaws were locally built with available materials like heavy, uncoated metal, chains, and wood, constructed with little regard for impact absorption from a fall or any measures to prevent falls in the first place. The formation of the Playground Association of America in 1906 was a turning point in the playground movement. This new association, led by notable names like Luther Gulick, the father of PE, Jane Addams, Jacob Riis, and others, published manuals and periodicals containing best practices and design standards. The Playground Association of America, or PAA, brought together reformers, educators, city officials, and philanthropists from across the nation to promote the development of playground and recreation programs, marking the end of the experimental era and the beginning of the standardization era of playgrounds. The PAA advocated that playgrounds were essential to the health and social well-being of children, that playgrounds should be within walking distance of every child, and be equipped with supervision and proper facilities. By 1910, playground equipment had started to be mass-produced, and more than 50 cities had playground programs by that point. This movement was really taking off. But then, the Great Depression hit. I feel like I say that in every episode. The Great Depression decimated municipal budgets. Cities started cutting funding for playground development and maintenance on the existing ones, while they tended to more pressing matters, like the collapsed economy. When 1 out of 4 Americans were unemployed and standing in food lines, playgrounds suddenly looked like a luxury that cities could no longer afford to keep funding. But don't dismay, FDR's New Deal will save the day. As you probably already know, in 1935, FDR enacted the New Deal, one of the most important laws in American history, establishing Social Security and unemployment insurance, giving us the safety nets that are still in place today. Part of this New Deal included the WPA, or Works Progress Administration, later renamed Work Projects Administration. It was a federal division that employed millions of people for public works projects during the Great Depression. WPA workers built and repaired roads, bridges, schools, hospitals, libraries, airports, numerous parks, and of course, playgrounds. They didn't build just a few here and there. They built almost 13,000 of them in cities, towns, schoolyards, and residential areas. Because part of the mission of the WPA was to maximize labor hours, they often chose labor-intensive materials like reinforced concrete and stone for wading pools, shower basins, retaining walls, stairs, bathrooms, and even animal sculptures for climbing on. These concrete elephants, hippos, and camels would eventually be taken down due to frequent injuries. The industrial-scale construction of these playgrounds were still not the safest. Hot metal slides and jungle gyms, asphalt, and concrete structures don't lend to safe play areas. But the good news is that when World War II hit and funding shifted away from public works toward military efforts, these WPA-built playgrounds were firmly in place. They were built to last. They didn't go anywhere, solidifying themselves as part of American life. And when the baby boomers were born, they entered a world of awesome playgrounds. The high demand for playgrounds from the baby boom, compounded by the post-war economic boom, and the rise of the suburbs, increased playground popularity and accelerated their growth. This was a very interesting time for playgrounds, as they entered another experimental period of design influenced by wartime manufacturing and space-age obsession. Playground equipment received an influx of repurposed military materials. Junk playgrounds became a thing. They're exactly what they sound like, just a playground full of junk for kids to play with. They contained scrap wood, rope, bricks, and old tires. The first one emerged in Denmark, and the trend spread to the UK, with the idea of inspiring kids to be creative with these loose materials. This concept was born out of the fact that kids were already playing in the rubble caused by the war's destruction. These junk playgrounds even made it over to the United States around 1950. It's crazy to think back to being in school during recess and playing on galvanized pipes, sheet metal slides, and old tires, not realizing that I was playing on wartime surplus. At the same time, playgrounds were getting a futuristic facelift with the implementation of abstract structures, high-speed spinning devices, rocket ships, flying saucers, planets, and satellites. Do yourself a favor right now and Google image 1950s futuristic playgrounds. They were incredible and incredibly dangerous. While playgrounds continued to be industrial with little focus on safety, it was around this time that serious efforts were made to document the high rates of injury on playgrounds. Kids were breaking bones and getting concussed left and right, not to mention getting scorched on the hot metal slides or getting road burn on the asphalt. Something had to be done. The National Recreation Association, formerly the PAA, had been working on this problem since 1929, when they issued their first formal proposal to develop playground apparatus standards. Their update to that proposal in 1938 focused heavily on safer surface materials, but these efforts never gained much ground. As I explained before, playground equipment only grew less safe during the post-war years. Injury research had begun in the 60s and 70s, and in 1978, a study found that 59% of playground injuries were a result of falling onto hard surfaces, which validated decades of anecdotal concerns and finally motivated policymakers to make meaningful changes. It wasn't until 1981 that we received the most comprehensive national framework for safe playground design found in the Consumer Product Safety Commission guidelines. The 1980s, you guys. That's so late. From that moment on, playgrounds were built with safer materials, with fall preventative measures, and softer landing surfaces. Critics of these safety changes argue that it has led to a less adventurous experience for kids, stunting their creativity and their ability to develop risk-taking skills. The balance between safety and freedom has always been, and probably always will be, a central debate in playground design. I sort of see it both ways. I bet playgrounds were a lot more fun when the slides were 2 stories high and you could become a projectile on a rapidly spinning merry-go-round. Playgrounds today seem a bit boring in comparison. But I also see the value in not having to risk breaking bones in order to have fun. I'm sure there are people out there who would disagree with that. From simple sand gardens in Germany to junk playgrounds to the modern, more docile playground, this has been quite the journey. In America, what began as a place of refuge for immigrant children evolved and transformed alongside social priorities and ideals. Each era, from the late 1800s through the 1980s, was reflected in playground design. To me, the most inspiring part of this history is how many people came together to give children a place to develop through play, to exercise, socialize, confront challenges, and be creative. That's the origin of playgrounds. When I come back, we'll dive into the origins of some of the different components commonly found on the playground. Don't go anywhere. I'd like to take a moment to thank our listeners around the globe. A huge shout out to our listeners in France. You're leading the stats outside of the US. Merci infiniment pour votre soutien. If you find value in what we're doing here, click the Patreon link in the show notes and send us a recurring donation of $5, $10, or whatever you can afford. Remember to also follow and share the show so we can continue to build a community of people who are curious and always learning. Now, back to the show. I've already covered the origin of sandboxes, so we're good there. But another feature that seems to come standard with any playground is the swing. Any guesses on how old swings are? Because I could picture swings existing in any time period, don't you? Well, we would be right to think so, because swings are so old that they show up in ancient Egypt mythology. The swing's legendary origins are rooted in the mythology of the two deities, Isis and Osiris. It's kind of a whole thing that I won't get into here, but swinging on swings was a ritual performed for crops to grow, symbolic of the motion of the wind and the growing of grain that are a part of the Isis and Osiris mythological story. What's important here is that swings were around back then, making them 4,000 to 5,000 years old, if not older. The oldest physical representation of a swing ever found is a terracotta sculpture from 1450 to 1300 BCE in ancient Greece. It's a clay model of a woman sitting on a plank suspended by rope, hanging from two pillars. China was using swings during the Han Dynasty, which spanned roughly 400 years from 206 BCE to 220 CE. It's possible that swings may have been present in China way earlier than that, but all the evidence for any swinging in China before the Han Dynasty is legendary and literary, not archaeological. Caves in India containing Buddhist frescoes from the 5th century CE depict the deity Naga Arundhati on a swing. And in Mesoamerica, small ceramic figurines of monkeys or humans seated on a small swing were found in the Gulf Coast region of Mexico, dating back to the Totonac people who lived there between 600 to 900 CE. It's cool to see how swings were popping up in cultures around the world independent of one another. Humans just like to swing, I guess. The swing survived the Middle Ages and the colonial era, arrived in America, and eventually landed a role in the playground equipment lineup. Next up, the teeter-totter, or the seesaw, depending on where you're from. The word seesaw first appears in English in 1704, describing a back-and-forth motion of a cutting tool, while the earliest use of teeter-totter in America is 1789. But both teeter and totter are words that date back to the Middle Ages. Teeter meaning to wobble, while totter has uncertain origins, perhaps Norwegian origins, meaning to swing to and fro. Anyway, either term today refers to the long plank on a central fulcrum. One person sits on one end of the plank, and the other person sits on the other end, and they take turns going up and down inversely. I never found the seesaw to be any fun. But where did they come from? The earliest physical evidence of a seesaw appears in ancient Greek art from the 5th century BCE. It appears on a vase showing two girls balancing on a plank over a support. Some historians think that this simple design could have existed much earlier, and, like the swing, the seesaw could have developed independently in many cultures. After all, it's an easy thing to slap together. You set a long plank on a log or a rock, and boom, instant entertainment. So the seesaw is at least 2,400 years old, and it eventually made its way to the playground. Next up is the carousel. Carousels have such a rich history that they could be their own episode, but I'll give you the bird's eye view here. The roots of the carousel stretch back to the 6th century in Byzantium, an ancient Greek city in modern-day Istanbul, where a sort of amusement ride swung baskets outward from a rotating pole in the center. You still see these swing rides at carnivals today. They're a distant ancestor of the carousel. Another precursor, and a more direct ancestor of the carousel, dates back to 12th century Arabian and Turkish cavalry training, where warriors rode in a tight circle on horses, throwing a breakable ball filled with perfume. If you mishandled the ball, it would break open, causing you to reek of perfume, marking you as the loser. This training game was called carosella, the direct linguistic origin of carousel, meaning little battle. This training exercise spread through Europe and evolved to become military displays and noble pageantry as public spectacles. And this tradition eventually turned into a mechanical rotating device with suspended wooden horses. By the 19th century, steam power shaped the carousel into what we know them to be today. The children's playground in Golden Gate Park in San Francisco had a carousel, remember? But we don't typically see carousels in playgrounds. Instead, we see merry-go-rounds. They are the less expensive version of a carousel. Playground designers took the concept of a carousel and made it simpler and human-powered. Merry-go-rounds became a classic piece of playground equipment starting in the early 20th century. If you had to take a guess, how old do you think slides are? In my mind, sliding down a smooth surface seems like another one of those things that would have always existed. But the slide is a modern invention. Sure, natural slides on muddy or icy hillsides and slick rocks have been around and used for millennia. But there is no documented evidence of any man-made slides for work or play before the year 1900. The earliest record of a slide comes from a rooftop playground in New York in 1900. That's crazy to me. And finally, the last one I'll do for this episode is the monkey bars, aka the jungle gym. It was patented in 1920 by Sebastian Hinton of Chicago. He got the idea from his mathematician father, who built a bamboo grid for his kids to play on to teach them about how to physically navigate through a coordinate system using spatial thinking, or something like that. The math lesson was lost on the kids, I'm sure, but they loved climbing on this bamboo structure. So Sebastian Hinton created a metal version and called it a jungle gym, after the idea of children moving through it like monkeys. The monkey bars referred to the portion of the jungle gym that featured a horizontal ladder used for hanging and swinging from rung to rung from one end to the other. Over time, the term monkey bars became casually used for the entire structure, and both monkey bars and jungle gyms were terms that were used interchangeably to refer to this American staple of playgrounds. And that's it for today. In case you didn't know, you can go to ontheoriginpod.com to see photos and descriptions of everything I cover in these episodes. So go check it out. And next time you take your kids to the playground or drive by one, hopefully you'll reflect on how much history is behind each structure and what it took to put playgrounds all over your city or town, in public parks, residential areas, and schoolyards. I know I will. Until next time, so long. Research, music, and production was all done by Desiree Wilson. This podcast is listener supported. owned and operated by Jez and myself under the On the Origin of Everything LLC in the United States. All rights reserved. We can be reached via email at info@ontheoriginpod.com.